Buenas tardes, bienvenidos, bienvenidas a la tarde, la última tarde de LASA. Yo soy Lynn Steven, la presidenta de LASA, y me da muchísimo gusto que tenemos este panel, Puerto Rico post-Hurricane Maria, Origins and Consequences of a Crisis. This panel, I guess, is going to be in English. Pero nuestra política lingüística, si hay intercambio, es que cada uno habla lo que más le da la gana. Bueno, no en palabras exactamente, pero por idioma. So thank you very much. I want to say this was one of the first themes that I put on my list of presidential panels 2 years ago. And it's very important for us to continue to give attention and publicity to the situation in Puerto Rico. And we're making una llamada. If this is going to be live streamed, there'll be a link on LASA, so we encourage you all to get that link and put it up on your institutional pages so that we can help to disseminate. You know, people forget. We got to keep reminding them about what is going on in Puerto Rico, all the amazing solidarity and alliances that have happened and are still happening. So I don't want to take any more time from the panel, but welcome, and I'm very much looking forward to our presentations and discussions.
Thank you so much, Lane. Appreciate it. So, buenas tardes. Thank you for being here today. We're just going to go ahead and introduce the panelists. We have a panel of distinguished scholars, and I'm going to read their names and affiliations in the order they're going to present. I'm going to make a short introduction to the topic, and then Marie Mora is going to present excerpts from her book, and then Dr. Hector Cordero Guzman from Baruch College is going to present his work, and finally Charles Venator from University of Connecticut is going to present her work, his work. I'm sorry. So as you can see, we start with a slide that shows the cover of the special issue of the Central Journal. Most of what we're going to discuss here today is contained in various articles in that special issue of the journal. It's available on our website, and please do reach out to me later. We have a pamphlet that summarizes the findings. I'll be happy to send you a copy, and you can always purchase a copy of the journal in our website. So, though I know that most of you know the ABC of the Puerto Rico crisis, let me just say that it obviously is portrayed mostly as an economic crisis. It's related to the debt crisis, but in reality, we're talking about intersecting crises in plural. You also have to talk about the unfolding humanitarian crisis prior to Maria and the impact of the hurricane in the population, which has resulted in massive exodus and other social consequences that the panelists are going to discuss. And finally, it's also a political crisis exemplified by the enactment of PROMESA by Congress and all the implications. And we have all our panelists addressing various aspects of this crisis. As an economist, I have to start just giving you some highlights as to what do we mean when we talk about the economic crisis. As you can see, this is the economic activity index published by the Government Development Bank. It's sort of the history of the Puerto Rico economy in a nutshell. And as you can see, it starts in 1980, and you can see that Section 936 was enacted in the late 1970s as a solution to the so-called oil crisis at the time. And once the factories, mostly pharmaceutical, high-tech companies, started getting to Puerto Rico, you can see that the Puerto Rico economy kind of took off, all the way up to about when the Section 936 expired around 2005, 2006. That's the sort of, in a nutshell, what happened. Since then, the Puerto Rican economy has been declining. And as you can see, after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, the economy was at a level of economic activity similar to the 1980 when they started taking into account the Government Development Bank. Now, the economy has bounced back a little bit, but it's amazing. You can think about a country that so many decades after is back at the level where they started back in 1980. So that means that a lot of the economic gains that Puerto Rico had were wiped out. And this is how the debt crisis is sort of the underlying phenomenon, but it really is about economic activity. But you can see here the composition of the debt comparing 1996 when the phase out of 936 corporations were started, 2006 when they expire, the credits expire, and you can see the accumulation of debt. The brilliant idea at that time was to expand public corporations, create the urban train and so forth, some major capital infrastructural projects that actually indebted Puerto Rico even deeper than what it was in 1996. And that solution, of course, in retrospect, was a complete failure. All that infrastructural development led Puerto Rico to more debt, but no real significant increase in economic activity in the island. And if you look at 2014, that's the story that basically says that what the public corporations did was to continue borrowing as a way to solve the insolvency of those corporations. That's the green light. The government obligation bonds, which are the red line, expanded a little bit. But the new kid on the block was COFINA. It was a new way of finding funding that indebted the country. And as you know, those funds were restructured. If there are questions about that, I can address that issue later. In any case, that was not the only debt. The $74 billion represented by the public debt was not all. In addition, you have about $50 billion in pension obligations that the government did not pay their workers, right? So what they did was that all throughout this period, they were using pension funding to balance the budget and not paying to the pensioners. The end story of that is that they now instituted a pay-as-you-go system, and that means that the working class in Puerto Rico pays as you go the pensions of the public employees. They're cutting those pensions, and this is not the end of the situation of the retirees in Puerto Rico. And enters Congress. So all this mess needs to be cleared out, needs some kind of intervention. And Congress did intervene. They enacted PROMESA. PROMESA has two main features. One is the restructuring of the debt, for which we all fought. All the Puerto Rican community fought to give Puerto Rico the right to restructure that debt. But that came with a caveat. The second item of PROMESA, you have to take a fiscal oversight board to control your finances. And it's undisputable that the local political elites were incapable of taking Puerto Rico out of the debt and to restore a sound economic strategy. Whether PROMESA was the solution or not, we'll see what this panel has to say. But in any case, it has resulted in draconian budget cuts and other things that you have heard. Then came Maria, and Maria changed everything. You're going to hear a bit more about that in the panel. And still today, we're paying the consequences of that. After, it's going to be the second anniversary in September. We all planning different events to acknowledge the fact that Puerto Rico is still in the midst of an economic and a crisis and in a recovery process. But after thousands of debt, right, and the rebuilding sort of the electrical grid, and the revamping of water supplies, and so on and so forth, Puerto Rico is still in a hole. Many crops have not bounced back. Coffee takes 5 years to bounce back. And the estimated damages, right? Congress is still debating whether money will come to Puerto Rico to subsidize those investments and repairs that need to be done. But the most important thing that we are going to address today, one of the most important things, is what is the impact of that crisis in Puerto Rico with respect to the diaspora, to the stateside Puerto Ricans. Why? Because the exodus from Puerto Rico has led to a renewal, if you will, of Puerto Rican communities, both the good things and the bad things. And we have witnessed an unprecedented migration wave, an exodus prior to Maria and post-Maria. And my colleagues are going to expand on that. And this historical moment is different from other prior exodus, right? For one, we're concentrated out in Florida. More generally, we're going to the Southwest and other parts. But more importantly, the dispersion of the Puerto Rican community have increased substantially. So what are the implications of that, right? How do we elect public officials when we're dispersed? How do we reproduce our culture, our heritage with our kids? How do we attend school systems that pay attention to our kids when we're so dispersed? Florida is one thing, the rest of the nation is another thing. And this is how it looks for a historical perspective. Look at the migration of the 1950s, the so-called Great Migration, with about 600,000 people leaving Puerto Rico in a span of a decade. Now look at the most recent one, and those are different measures of how do we measure migration. But what is that graphic saying? That the current exodus is deeper than the one in the 1950s. So if that was the Great Migration, what is it that we have today? And the difference between 1950 and today is that it hasn't ended. It continues as we speak. So this is a very telling graphic. The last time I was working on this graphic, Miriam, my wife, was in the back, and she started cracking, saying, crying. But what's going to happen to Puerto Rico, she said. This is what's happening to Puerto Rico. It's a systemic process of depopulation of the island, okay? Whoever is responsible for this have created a situation for the Puerto Rican people that is without precedent. If you look back at the beginning onset of the economic crisis, mid-2000, Puerto Ricans in the diaspora and Puerto Rico were about the same. Today, Maria just aggravated a pattern. Maria did not start the exodus of Puerto Ricans, the massive exodus of Puerto Ricans. Maria exacerbated that. Today, there are over 5.5 million Puerto Ricans in the stateside, and about 3.1, 3.2, depends on the numbers that we're going to see shortly from the census in the island. But it's a continuous depopulation. That leads to school closures, to housing crisis, and each one of those topics, the consequences for the island, Centro has produced reports. I'll be happy to send you a copy of those at the end, just let me know. But this is sort of a bird's eye view of the budget in Puerto Rico. 2016, before the Fiscal Oversight Management Board started doing the budgets, and 2018, which is the most recent one. Which are the budget lines that are most affected by all this restructuring? UPR, education, criminal justice system, health, the basic services that Puerto Ricans in the island need. More importantly, the budget line that is growing is something called budget office. You know what that budget office line is for? Anyone can guess what that is for? To repay the debt. And that has grown exponentially. Why? Because all the projections that the Fiscal Oversight Board did, and the Garcia Padilla and the Rosselló administration did about repayment of the debt and debt sustainability has been thrown out of board. Before, this graphic shows that the debt repayment was about 20 cents on the dollar, okay? Today, COFINA and PREPA, the two ones that I've done, instead of 20 cents on the dollar, they're paying more than 50 cents on the dollar, and for some bondholders, it's almost 85, 90% repayment. So these projections that the Oversight Board did, after everything is said and done, all the suffering that the Puerto Rican people are enduring, this is the best they can tell us. This is the gross domestic product projections. The blue line is prior to Maria, and the red line is the infusion of funding after Maria. So after everything is said and done, by 2026, 10 years after the enactment of PROMESA, 10 years after the Fiscal Oversight Board, the economy is projected to be in negative territory, continue the decline of gross domestic product. This is what we're promised in Puerto Rico. And there are some future scenarios, but I'm going to stop here because it seems I'm running out of time, and my colleagues are getting desperate. But in the Q&A, I will address some future scenarios and some final thoughts about this. And I think I'm going to pass the baton to Marie. So I'm also a TI person, so I have to see if I can get you here. Marie. Enjoy. So, dime cuál es, mija. So thank you for listening. Mira, This one? This one? Okay.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Edwin. As I get started, I would very much like to thank the session organizers for inviting me to be a part of this. This is a topic that is something that is of extreme interest to me. I'm very, very passionate about talking about this, so I thank you for giving me this opportunity. I also want to thank LASA for having this session, particularly the president's here. I'm very happy to see that, and the fact that we are being live streamed so that even if people cannot watch us or be here today in person, they will still have access to our panel. I'm going to be presenting some of my findings through a series of different research products. In particular, I do have a book that came out in November 2017 that is focusing on the economic crisis building up to what Edwin was just describing in terms of the pre-Maria conditions versus post-Maria. I also have one of the articles that's in the Central Journal that Edwin just mentioned, in addition to other manuscripts and other work. My work I've been doing primarily with Alberto Davila, who's at Southeast Missouri State University, and also Navidan Rodriguez, who is at the University of Albany, State University of New York. As a plug for Navidan, he is the president at University of Albany, SUNY. He's originally from Arecibo. He is the first Latino, not just the first Puerto Rican, but the first Latino president of any four-year SUNY schools. When our book came out in 2017, we actually got our galley proofs literally 2 days after Hurricane Maria struck. And so we begged our editor to please let us have at least an addendum to begin addressing how we marked the 100-year anniversary of the 1917 Jones-Shafrath Act, which collectively granted Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship. We thought it was very ironic that after 100 years of collective U.S. citizenship, that Puerto Rico was facing an unprecedented economic crisis that had been surging, as we just heard from Edwin, since 2006. We also saw massive net out migration before Hurricane Maria. What Hurricane Maria has done is exacerbated a lot of the outcomes to what we ended up describing as la crisis boricua. We kept talking in our book when we were first writing it about the economic crisis, but it was so severe that we thought it needed its own standalone name rather than just simply referring to it as a crisis. It has also been described as Puerto Rico's depression. This means that moving forward, Puerto Ricans on the island, as well as Edwin pointed out, on the mainland, are facing grave and unprecedented economic, social, and demographic challenges. There are also some opportunities, however. Whenever I present my work, I always have a slide about why the U.S. at large should care. Certainly with a crowd like this, I don't think that there's really a question about why they should care, but I think it's always worthwhile to remind people. In addition, internationally, we have seen a lot of outpouring of concern for humanitarian purposes. But again, as a reminder, Puerto Ricans are indeed U.S. citizens. So in terms of being in the U.S., we should care if our fellow American citizens are undergoing the amount of suffering that they've gone through, not just with Hurricane Maria, but again, over a decade beforehand. There are currently, and again, as Edwin mentioned, depending on estimates, there are about 3.2 million Puerto Ricans who are living on the island, and another 5.6 million people who identify as being Puerto Rican who are on the U.S. mainland. That means that combined, we are talking about close to 9 million people that are affected by this crisis. If you think 3.2 million might sound small from a population point of view, note that 21 states in the U.S. have populations that are smaller than 3.2 million. So if we were to see an entire state, let's say like Nevada or Arkansas or Montana, Vermont, et cetera, going through the issues that Puerto Rico has gone through, I think we might hear more about it in the news than what we have. Washington, D.C. also has less than 3.2 million. And as Edwin mentioned, the presence and impact of Puerto Ricans on the mainland has been increasing, including in many non-traditional settlement areas. So Florida has become one of the biggest settlement areas of Puerto Ricans, which we describe in our book as being an old new destination area. Florida became more popular in the 1970s and 80s, but Texas even has been a big receiving area of migrants from the island. Right now, the population shifts have been so dramatic that some estimates have there are more Puerto Ricans living in Florida than in the state of New York. This also means that the longer this crisis takes to address, the longer will be the cycle of net out-migration, demographic shift, economic decline, and continued human suffering. On September 20th, 2017, many of you might remember watching the news in terms of the hurricane making landfall. And I remember watching it very closely. And Hurricane Maria had been a very strong Category 5, and it did weaken to technically a Category 4. And I remember watching the news, and people were saying, oh, what a relief, it's weakened. Well, it did weaken to a Category 4, but it was only 2 miles shy of wind speed from a Category 5. So for all practical purposes, it was a Category 5. And if we think about it in terms of wind speeds of a tornado, this is equivalent to an EF3 tornado. The hurricane went across the entire island, bringing catastrophic devastation and suffering. In the immediate aftermath, the entire island's then population, so it has continued declining. At the time, it was 3.3 million residents. The entire island was left without electricity, running water, telecommunications, basic transportation systems, essentially basic services. The problem with transportation being wiped out is that also prevented the distribution of aid and medical supplies. Even after 3 months, electricity had not been restored to nearly half of the island, so we're talking about millions of American citizens that did not have access to basic services several months afterwards, and in some cases it took literally a year to restore these basic services to American citizens. The official death toll currently stands at 2,975. In terms of population size, this is almost a full 1/10 of a percentage point of Puerto Rico's entire population. Okay, very dramatic, it's a very large decline in the population. And note that some estimates have the death toll even higher than that. To put this into recent historical perspective, there were this was more than 1,000 fatalities from the death toll that we saw from Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf Coast, which was estimated at 1,833. Many of these fatalities on the island have been attributed not to the initial impact from Maria, but because of the slow and inadequate response and restoration of basic services following. But again, we need to consider that it was not Hurricane Maria that led to the massive net out migration, that has led to a lot of the economic crisis as well as the humanitarian crisis that Edwin mentioned. We can go back, actually many years, not just 2006, but in our book we have a chapter called 2006, the Year of the Perfect Storm. So no reference to Hurricane Maria in that particular chapter. But a lot of things essentially came together to culminate that kicked off what, again, we referred to as the La Crisis Boricua. There's only been 1 year positive economic growth since 2006, and that was way back in 2012. Part of this was driven by this expiration of the IRS Code Section 936, which for a 20-year period, actually it turned out to be a 30-year period, had provided corporations tax credits, tax advantages with operating on the island. It was announced in 1996 there would be a 10-year phase-out period where these tax credits would be eliminated, so that on January 1st, 2006, these tax credits had gone. Many companies scaled back. Not all of them left the island, but many of them scaled back. And so if we consider when you're losing business and industry, you're losing jobs and earnings, and which means then banks are losing their bank deposits, banks then are losing capital, and from the government's perspective, the government is losing tax revenue. To address some of the budgetary issues, 2006, actually the government shut down for a short period of time while they were working through some of the budget. Part of this, they decided to eliminate numerous public sector jobs, tens of thousands of them, the cuts which have continued since then. Again, we're going back to 2006. This led to a further loss of jobs, a further loss of earnings, further loss of bank deposits and tax revenue. The government at the time also imposed a sales tax, the IVU, which at the time was established at 7%. The IVU did not exist before 2006. Now 7% seems low. It was raised in 2015 to 11.5%, which for the record is higher than any state sales tax. The loss of the employment opportunities, both in the private sector and public sector, has spurred massive out-migration on the largest scale ever seen, as Edwin pointed out. Relative to the size of the population, before Hurricane Maria, it was smaller, again, compared to the size of the population, compared to the Great Migration, although since Hurricane Maria, the estimates suggest that even the period we're seeing now has surpassed the Great Migration. So it's equivalent to about 1 out of every 5 Puerto Ricans have migrated since 2006 in terms of the population loss. And if we consider what implications this has for the island, who's moving? Basically younger people in their childbearing years, so who are having kids on the U.S. mainland. In fact, the population growth among Puerto Ricans on the U.S. mainland is growing much more quickly than even the national average. On the island, the population growth is negative. The population has been shrinking. And the population that's left behind is not just shrinking in size, it's also rapidly aging. Because again, people who are leaving are younger and they're having kids elsewhere. So the kids are not as many kids are being born on the island as we're seeing on the mainland. In our book, we talk about, and we analyze some of the characteristics of migrants. We don't have time to go into those today. But we generally don't find that the migrants are disproportionately drawn from a high-skilled part of the distribution. But there is a significant number of doctors and physicians who have left throughout the crisis, again, before Hurricane Maria. And some of that is tied to the underpayment that they get for Medicare services. The doctors who have been leaving means that we have a population that is getting older and will need these medical services when we have fewer doctors. And the doctors who have left behind also tend to be older. Many of them are in retirement ages. Edwin already mentioned the debt. So it's not just the public debt, but also the unfunded pension obligations. Promesa has been very controversial, as Edwin mentioned. It has certainly reinvigorated some of the debates about what is Puerto Rico's true status with respect to the U.S. People have said it's essentially a pseudo-colony or de facto colonial status. And again, there have been some highlights about the lack of representation in Congress. Puerto Rico also filed for federal bankruptcy protection in May 2017. And just to put this into perspective, a consulting firm predicted in 2016, December, again before Hurricane Maria, that the island's economy would not be restored to its 2006 level until the year 2034. And that was their middle-of-the-road scenario. Their pessimistic scenario was 2042. This was Puerto Rico's reality when Hurricane Maria struck. Edwin mentioned about the outmigration, so I just wanted to share this slide with you to give you an idea of inflows and outflows between the island and mainland. So the one that really stands out is the one that's on your far right, which is Puerto Rico. So the red represents outflows, and then the green represent inflows. So again, if we take the difference between the two, we see the net migration, which again for Puerto Rico has been negative. The one that's on your far left is Florida, and so Florida has received the largest share of migrants from the island. Even before Hurricane Maria, they were receiving about 1/3 of all the migrants from the island. I don't have it here, but also we analyzed some of the interstate migration patterns of Puerto Ricans. Florida is also the largest net receiver of interstate migrants on the mainland. The estimates of post-Maria migration, actually they look very similar in terms of where people are going, except that it's at least 40% who have been going to Florida. So Florida remains a very key destination area. Other states are Pennsylvania, New York, and again Texas, Massachusetts, we're here in Boston, New Jersey, and Connecticut, plus others. To give you an idea about the population implications of people left behind, I want to show you just very quickly, some population pyramids. The population pyramids looking at the distribution of age on the island between men and women, men being the red and the yellow being women. This is going back to 1950. We had the vast majority of the Puerto Rican population on the island that were young. This is going to 2000 and to the year 2000. We can see then the Puerto Rican population has been aging. This was again before the economic crisis kicked off. In 2015, we get this beehive shape, which means that the population is rapidly aging. Population projections before Hurricane Maria, this is going to the year just 2025. These were done, the population projections were done, I think in 2016, 2017. And again, when you get the beehive shape, it means that your population is getting older. And by the year 2050, it was projected that the population pyramid would look as such. And again, this is before Hurricane Maria, which has only exacerbated these issues. In terms of looking forward to rebuilding, what are some of the biggest impediments? Well, certainly the unresolved crisis that we've been seeing since 2006 is one of them. That has not been resolved. It started escalating in 2006, but we have the debt, we have massive net out-migration that has continued with the diaspora and the demographic shift, leaving behind the shrinking and rapidly aging population. That is going to be another impediment. Lack of representation in Congress seems to be an issue, as many of us have seen. This is affecting not just the awarding and the distribution of, the amount of aid going to the island, but also just the basic distribution of it. With the 5.6 million mainland Puerto Ricans, it is important to note that they are represented in Congress, and they may have a larger voice and a larger role to play in the rebuilding. Puerto Rico right now lacks basic policy tools to rebuild. Again, with Promesa, Promesa has tied Puerto Rico's hands in using fiscal policy to rebuild, because everything Puerto Rico is doing with respect to its budget, it has to get approval from Promesa. The Oversight Board has been controversial. I'm not going to read all these points. These are some of the things people have been discussing. But one of the biggest concerns is that the Oversight Board was not designed to be accountable either to the Puerto Rican government nor to the Puerto Rican people, raising concerns that they seem to be more and could be more favoring of bondholders instead of the well-being of the Puerto Rican population. So that means moving forward, when we're thinking about rebuilding, it may not be in the interest of the Puerto Ricans as it is to other stakeholders. I like this quote that came out in Harvard Law Review a couple of years ago, again before Hurricane Maria, describing PROMESA, and the description is that PROMESA is much closer to legislation envisioned within a colonial relationship than a federal one. The Puerto Rican people certainly seem to see it as such. Something that very much worries me is that there is now a threat of having new taxes on intellectual property in what are described as foreign areas. For the purpose of this policy, Puerto Rico would be described as foreign. So we're going from a situation with the Section 936 where companies had a tax advantage to being on the island, to the elimination of that tax advantage, but neutral, to, if this goes through, then having a disadvantage from operating on the island. I don't know the current status of that. High cost of living is another issue, again, with the EVU, energy prices, et cetera. There's been concern about the lack of data and transparency, including in the awarding of federal government contracts. Federal government contracts are often, they're supposed to go to people who are most affected, that is, people from the area, and many of these have not been. So in closing, it's important to emphasize that Puerto Rico was already encountering an economic crisis that had also been described as a humanitarian crisis before Hurricane Maria struck. So it's imperative to rebuild Puerto Rico today and to ease the crisis that is leading to the suffering, mental and physical health issues and fatalities that are affecting millions of American citizens. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Edwin. Appreciate it.
Okay. Shit. I think it is in here. Jesus. Right? There you go.
Thank you to President Stevens for really putting Puerto Rico, the proverbial neither fish nor fowl of Latin American studies, into our discussion here. Truly appreciate it. And to my colleague, friend, and mentor, Edwin Melendez, for putting this panel together and give us an opportunity to share some thoughts about the overlapping crises that affect Puerto Rico, and also Charles and Marie, whose work I know and admire, and who's always a pleasure to share the podium and panel with. As often been mentioned, and it's really now broadly acknowledged, Puerto Rico is not going through one crisis. It's going over a series of interlapping, some of them longer term than other crises. There's a social dimension that's manifested in declining population and increased out-migration. There's an economic dimension reflected in reductions in employment and the flattening of incomes for the population in Puerto Rico. There's a fiscal dimension to the crises, which is manifested in high levels of government debt, and that political dimension to the crisis, which can be charitably put as calls among many sectors that the relationship between Puerto Rico and the U.S. is really not optimal at this stage of the game, and then that's sort of putting it mildly. And more recently, we've seen a psychological dimension to the crisis, manifested in increasing cynicism, pessimism, despair. Edwin mentioned increased suicide rates. And now, on top of that, you have the impacts of Hurricane Maria. And Puerto Rico occurs in a kind of broader historical context. I am of the idea that Puerto Rico's crisis sort of began in 1898, and we really haven't recovered from that quite yet. And while I talk about data in my presentation, and a lot of it is covered in a book that I published in 2016 on poverty in Puerto Rico, and one of the interesting aspects after the storm was to hear people saying that they discovered poverty in Puerto Rico after the storm. Having been working on poverty in Puerto Rico for 3 years before 2016, I thought that an odd comment. I was wondering where people were looking. And Puerto Rico is pretty well built to avoid seeing poverty. There's a lot of cement there that makes it look like there's no poverty, but there's really a lot of it deep down. And while I talk about data in my presentation, I think all of us do, and we use data. I'm not making an empiricist argument here. I'm connecting the economic crisis to the demographic crisis and then how it feeds back into an economic crisis. I'm also presenting a critique, trying to turn on its head the arguments that have been popularized in mainstream economics and sociological literatures about Puerto Rican dependency and pathology as the cause of the economic crisis and its poverty. I argue that this type of colonialist discourse is just a blame the victim colonialist discourse that masks the true nature of the social, economic, and political inequalities inside the island, and it perpetuates them. And at the same time, it really reflects an asymmetric power relationship that the U.S. and where the U.S. sets the broad and narrow parameters under which the island of Puerto Rico and the population that lives in it can operate and insert itself in the local, regional, and global economy and society. A combination of an absentee owner and a subservient but well-fed local elite have managed to run Puerto Rico and its population into the ground, and I figured I summarized my argument on the front end and then try to show you some pictures that I think illustrate that. The Center for Puerto Rican Studies that Edwin directs prepared some maps some time ago about the location of poverty on the island of Puerto Rico, and the red areas are areas where 70% or more of the population is below poverty, the darker red. The lighter red is where 50% or more of the population is below poverty. And even the lighter colors are 18% or more of the population is in poverty. Puerto Rico's poverty rate is 46% overall. Now it's gone down to about 44%. Not so much because the people there are less poor, but because out-migration has somewhat lowered the poverty rate. And the poverty rate for children is 58% on the island. And poverty declined by about 9 percentage points in between 1990 and 2000. And it only declined by about 4 percentage points in the 16 years since. And the extreme poverty rate, that's will be the one with the circle on it. That's people that are living about half of the poverty line, which is less than $6,000 a year. That number stayed at 25% of the population, about 1 in 4, over the last 20 years. And there have been some myths about Puerto Rico that have been propagated, and I spend a lot of time in the book and in other presentations trying to go over them, that Puerto Rico has low levels of education, that people in Puerto Rico don't want to work, that welfare payments are too generous, that welfare is a disincentive to work, and people can get welfare easily. And you can review a lot of academic writings that purport to kind of show this in economic language and other kinds of tools and techniques, that the minimum wage and labor laws are too generous and should be lowered. So Puerto Rico is sort of like a welfare labor paradise, and that's the reason for the crises. And in the end, low-wage workers, the poor, and other vulnerable populations are too costly, unproductive, and then to blame for the financial and economic crisis. And that's kind of sort of how the story goes. And around the time of the debt crisis, this kind of cartoon did the rounds, which essentially captures all of those myths in one image of the kind of lazy, overfed, debt-ridden welfare, generous welfare state produced kind of Puerto Rican. And when you think about colonial images, you know, here's one for you. I go then and spend some time trying to go over data to try to debunk all of this mythology. First, I go over education levels and show that about 52.6% of Puerto Ricans 25 to 65 years old had touched a university. I don't know where else in Latin America you can say that about 50% of the population, 25 to 65, have touched a university. And certainly in a bunch of states in the south of the United States of America. Not as many people have touched the university. And in fact, if you go to the census of 1898, the one that they subsequently published a couple of years later, they found, I think, 80% of the population couldn't read or write. So if there's one indicator where Puerto Rico's caught up to the US, it's in levels of education. So I don't think you can go to education as the cause for Puerto Rico's crisis, or the lack of people with degrees or skills or some such. What we do have is an economy that certainly collapsed around 2006. And again, when people talk about welfare as the cause of labor market collapse, I say, so what happened? One day in 2006, everybody said we're not going to work anymore? Certainly it's not a supply side, if you kind of follow economic debates, type of an explanation about people's desire to look for work. It's a demand side explanation about the collapse of an economic structure. And Marie and Edwin have gone into detail about this, so I won't spend more time. I'll just breeze through some of the pictures. And certainly the collapse of the juicy 936 subsidy has a lot to blame with Puerto Rico's labor market collapse. And what you see there is employment in Puerto Rico. Kind of every year that the number of people employed goes down onto the last line, which is the green line. If you see the months after Maria, the employment collapsed even further. So even if you wanted to look for work, your chances would be somewhat low of finding good employment. And you see a lot of college graduates doing work that used to be done by high school graduates before at the same wage. So that upskilled workforce is really not working upskilled jobs, it's working the same old crappy jobs of before at the same old crappy wage. And when you try to trace growth in welfare, welfare use in Puerto Rico and how it overlaps with the economy, you look at the red line, which is the kind of collapse of the labor market after 2006, and then you see that the blue line is take-up of some of the welfare programs. In this instance, the program that is the cash program, the TANF program. You see that there's like a 6-month lag between economic decline and take-up of people in the program. So it's not like people are taking the program or taking welfare and then the labor market collapses. It's that the labor market collapses and then people participate in the program. And the causality on this is about 6 to 9 months. And the pattern's fairly clear. And again, when you get the presentation, if you download it, you'll be able to see it in more detail. So to summarize, I mean, what I'm trying to argue is try to connect the various threads together into what's called the Puerto Rico's economic and demographic death spiral. The economic crisis leads to further labor market collapse. That leads to migration, loss of workers and families, changing population composition, as Marie was describing. That leads to loss of markets, sales volume, loss of revenues, loss of income. That leads to loss of government revenue, lower tax collection, fewer resources to cover expenses, make key investments, fight the crises. That leads to slow growth in economic activity, unemployment, persistent poverty, which feeds back into the economic crisis, leading to further labor market collapse, migration, loss of workers and families. And that's the spiral that Puerto Rico is sort of caught up in. And again, some of the pictures about population loss, Maria went over. I stole this one from Centro about the increased out-migration. And when you see where Irma and Maria landed, they landed in what's already a pretty vulnerable population. And I think I have 3 minutes, so I'll spend one on this and one concluding. About 380,000 people in Puerto Rico, about 10%, are both poor and disabled. If you just look at the people below poverty, it's the 46%, I told you, so about 1.6 million. That's when the population was about 3.5. If you look at people with below poverty and with a disability, that's about 56.2% of the population. And if you look at people below poverty or with a disability or younger than 18 or older than 65, that's 69.1% of Puerto Rico's population. Maria landed in a place where 70% of the people are either under 18, over 65, poor, or disabled. The consequences then can be fairly clear. These are the same pictures that Marie was showing about population loss. The estimates are the estimates. The point I drew to you is where Puerto Rico's population actually is. So Puerto Rico's population decline is going 20 years faster than the most pessimistic of UN population decline estimates. And then what I have in the rest of the presentation are just pictures that are just showing you the nature of population decline. And when you think about composition, the ages where Puerto Rico lost and the ages where Puerto Rico gained population are fairly clear, and that's the aging of the population. Am I done? Or are you telling me I have 2 minutes? Okay, cool. Perfect. And if you're a young Puerto Rican growing up, you can think of 2 paths for your future. You can think about the red path, which is your earnings if you stay in Puerto Rico, and you can think about the blue path, which is the earning of a Puerto Rican of the same age that lives in the US. If you kind of sum up all that over a work life, that could be about $800,000 difference. Again, money's not everything. But a Puerto Rican in the US that's age about 29 makes about as much as a Puerto Rican ever going to make in the island of Puerto Rico in their 40s and 50s prime working years. So that's a huge incentive to out-migrate. And the difference is huge even across education levels. So Puerto Rico has a few challenges. But the big one that I want to point out to you is the challenge of inequality. And when you look at the income distribution in Puerto Rico, it's about as unequal as you probably see it around the world, including Brazil and things like that. About the bottom 20% make about 1% of the income. The second 20% make 8% of the income. So the bottom 40% of the population makes about 9% of the income in Puerto Rico. If you go to the other extreme, the top 20% make about 55% of the income. And the top 5% make about 25% of the income. So it's not that Puerto Rico is not generating, is that Puerto Rico's generation is not going to the population, it's going to a very few people. So that's my last slide. Colonialism robs you of your past, sense of worth, and robs you of your present ability to sustain yourself, and robs you of the possibility of even imagining a better future, your future. Yeah? How can we expect a place with twice the poverty, 46% versus 21% for Mississippi, and half of the policy tools, as some of the programs do not even exist in Puerto Rico or may be capped? How can you expect a place like that to improve? Twice the problem, one hand tied behind your back. How could Puerto Rico not end up in a fiscal crisis? And why isn't there a Marshall Plan for Puerto Rico? Because Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans don't deserve it. They're to blame for the crises. It's their bad behavior, the spendthrift ways, their generous welfare and labor laws, the generous minimum wage. They're just used to living off federal subsidies and dependency. Did Puerto Rico go into a fiscal crisis because it did not generate the profits, or because it did not collect the tax, or because it did not collect the taxes of those profits to pay for what was needed to sustain the society? Who has benefits from Puerto Rico's colonial status? And I'm sorry I don't have answers, but I figured I'd throw some questions out there to get the discussion going. Thanks very much.
It's turning on. Oh, shit. There we go. Well, thank you. And thank you, Edwin, and thank you, Lassa, for this wonderful opportunity to talk about some of my research. Let me just say, I'm getting text messages from my 6-year-old and family that they're loving the presentation. And good comments. So I want to talk to you today about how the U.S. government legitimates all that we're seeing here through its citizenship policies and its constitutional policies. Central to my argument is a sort of ongoing debate on what's the status of Puerto Ricans, or rather, what's the status of persons born in Puerto Rico. And I argue that, drawing on the work of Adi Ophir and Antonio Vázquez Arroyo, that on the question of citizenship, what we've seen is a catastrophization of the concept of citizenship, particularly embraced by the local statehood movement in Puerto Rico in a way in order to create a sort of propaganda that will enable or that will scare electors into voting for the statehood option. And statehood, as you've known, has been emphasized in Puerto Rico more than dealing with the debt crisis, or at least by the statehood party. And they've pushed two propaganda arguments, namely that persons born in Puerto Rico are mere statutory citizens, and that Congress can involuntarily strip them of their citizenship anytime. And the second argument is that the federal response to Puerto Rico in the aftermath of the devastation caused by Hurricane Maria was a symptom of Puerto Rican second-class status. Those are the two prevailing, in my opinion, debates around the citizenship question of Puerto Ricans. Now, part of what I want to do today is argue that this is incorrect, and I want to do it in two ways. I want to explain to you a little bit about the constitutional status of Puerto Rico and give you an overview of the citizenship status of Puerto Ricans. Okay, so the first thing that I want to emphasize is that U.S. territorial policy for Puerto Rico is driven by an antinomy. An antinomy in philosophical terms is two legal logics that are coexistent, sometimes in a dialectical manner, sometimes in a contradictory manner. Central to my argument is that the Supreme Court has made a decision about the status of Puerto Rico, and Congress has parallelly enacted legislation that treats Puerto Rico differently when it's convenient, sometimes inconsistently with the Supreme Court, and so on and so forth. And I'll explain this in a second. Simply put, the Supreme Court, the final interpreter of the Constitution, has argued that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory that belongs to the United States, but is not a part of the United States. Under this logic developed between 1898 and 1901, Puerto Rico becomes a foreign territorial possession that can be treated as a foreign country for constitutional purposes. That has not changed in 120 years. In 1922, the Supreme Court modified this argument and essentially established that until Congress explicitly incorporates Puerto Rico remains a foreign territorial possession for constitutional purposes, for purposes of extending benefits, for any political purposes. And I'm going to read you a quick quote here, which should answer the first or the second question that I posed at the beginning. And this is from Balzac versus People of Puerto Rico, an unanimous decision authored by Chief Justice William Taft. In Puerto Rico, however, the Puerto Rican cannot insist upon the right of trial by jury, except as his own representatives in his legislature shall confer it on him. The citizen of the United States living in Puerto Rico cannot enjoy the right of trial by jury under the federal constitution any more than Puerto Rican. It is locality that is determinant of the application of the Constitution in such matters as judicial procedure, and not the status of the people who live in it. In other words, this is not a question of whether Puerto Ricans are second-class citizenship or not. It has to do with the status of the territory according to the Supreme Court of the United States. For more than a century, Congress, Democrats and Republicans, liberals, progressives, Green New Deal socialists, and conservatives alike have neglected to enact legislation that either incorporates Puerto Rico, as the advocates of statehood would push for, or address the doctrine of separate and unequal, the territorial doctrine that is used to rule Puerto Rico. If Congress were to take a measure to declare that Puerto Ricans should be treated equally, or that Puerto Rico should be treated as a part of the United States, we could address a lot of these issues that have been presented before us, at least from a constitutional perspective. Okay, simultaneously, Congress has invoked the Territories Clause as a source of authority or power to legislate for Puerto Rico, not just on citizenship, but on a whole range of social economic issues. Congress, over the years, has enacted a wide array of citizenship legislation to rule Puerto Rico, sometimes contradictory, sometimes in concert with the Supreme Court rulings. Congress has debated 101 citizenship bills for Puerto Rico. Congress has enacted 1 treaty and at least 10 laws containing citizenship provisions for Puerto Rico, and Congress has conferred 3 different types of citizenships on Puerto Ricans over the years. And let me give you a quick summary on these. When the United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898, they declared that the residents of Puerto Rico were going to be, the Spanish citizens residing in Puerto Rico were going to be Puerto Rican citizens, so non-citizen aliens. That meant they were citizens of nowhere. They could not naturalize and acquire U.S. citizenship, but they could not retain their Spanish citizenship. And they remained in this status until 1934, when Congress began to eliminate the idea of the Puerto Rican citizenship. This was introduced in the Treaty of Paris of 1898, normalized in Section 7 of the Foraker Act, and then reified all the way up to 1934. In other words, until 1934, persons born in Puerto Rico could become Puerto Rican citizens, and many did. Then by 1899, Puerto Rican women who married U.S. citizens were able to both acquire the citizenship of their spouses and transfer that citizenship status to their children under the doctrine of coverture. It used to be that women who married, at least until 1934 in Puerto Rico, 1931 in the mainland, acquired the citizenship status of their husbands by mere act of marriage. This was a form of individual naturalization. In 1906, as a result of a series of administrative problems, Congress begins enacting legislation that allows individual Puerto Ricans to go to a district court in the mainland and naturalize. And Puerto Ricans began doing this. In 1914, Puerto Ricans serving in the armed forces were able to count their service as a form of naturalization, consistent with residency requirements. Then in 1917, again as a result of a series of administrative problems, Congress enacts the Jones Act of 1917 and collectively naturalizes Puerto Ricans, or the residents of Puerto Rico, without changing the territorial status of Puerto Rico. That means anyone born after 1917 acquires citizenship only if their father was a U.S. citizen, because citizenship was then transferred by blood. This created a range of problems, and Congress amended the Jones Act on several occasions all the way up to 1948, but essentially replaced the Jones Act in 1940 by extending birthright citizenship to Puerto Rico. Now this is a little bit controversial, and I have some time so I can give you some evidence that I didn't think I was going to be able to give you. But essentially in 1940, Congress said, we have a mess in Puerto Rico. People are born in Puerto Rico, they're getting detained, they're losing their citizenship. We have to do something about this. Why don't we apply the precedent that we developed in 1927 for the U.S. Virgin Islands. And let me give you a summary of what that looks like. According to the President Roosevelt's committee and to Congress, the citizenship status of persons born in the United States and in incorporated territories is determined by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The proposed changes in the law governing the acquisition of nationality at birth relate to unincorporated territories at birth in foreign countries to parents, one or both of whom are American citizens. So from the very beginning, Congress believed that the source of birthright citizenship was the 14th Amendment. In the proposed new law, the 1940 Nationality Act, this condition is eliminated and birth in Puerto Rico will have the same effect as birth in the continental United States. So Congress intended to change the constitutional status of citizens born in Puerto Rico. In other words, this section will in effect apply the rule of jus soli to Puerto Rico as of the date of its annexation to the United States, treating Puerto Rico for such purposes as an incorporated territory for the United States. It places Puerto Rico on par with the Virgin Islands with regards to the effect of birth therein since its annexation to the United States. In other words, it uses the precedent established by the 1927 birthright citizenship law in the Virgin Islands and applies it to Puerto Rico. According to Senator Frank B. Willis, the relevant section of U.S. Virgin Islands citizenship legislation states, and I quote, Section 3 provides for persons here and after born in the Virgin Islands of the United States the rule of citizenship already provided by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The congressional record is clear. Congress intended to use the 14th Amendment as the source for citizenship for Puerto Rico, or persons born in Puerto Rico. All persons born in Puerto Rico since 1941, January 13, 1941, have acquired birthright citizenship. Now, here's the antinomy. If the Supreme Court continues to say that Puerto Rico is a foreign country, how can a person born in Puerto Rico be born in the United States? If you follow the Supreme Court, the ultimate interpreter of the Constitution, birth in Puerto Rico is tantamount to birth in the Dominican Republic or Italy, to use the exact case that they use, or Argentina or Korea or Moscow. However, if you believe that Congress has the authority to govern the territories, then persons born in Puerto Rico are birthright citizens. Now, what are the implications of this argument as a matter of conclusion? First, Congress does not have the power to unilaterally strip Puerto Ricans of their citizenship, no matter how much advocates of statehood may claim. There are two arguments here. Professor Jose Julian Alvarez Gonzalez has made this argument 30 years ago, that over the years the Supreme Court has extended due process rights to Puerto Ricans and equal protection rights. So in order to strip individual Puerto Ricans of their citizenship, there would have to be upwards of 6 million individual court hearings to justify stripping people's citizenship. Or you can agree with me and say, well, Congress has said that the 14th Amendment extends to Puerto Ricans through a statute. The second argument, which is the one that bothers me a little bit more, is that access to rights and benefits in Puerto Rico is not determined by the citizenship status of Puerto Ricans. It is determined by the island's unincorporated territorial status, a constitutional status that can be addressed without having to solve the political status. I would love to solve the political status, but that's a decision of Puerto Ricans. Liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans can say Puerto Rico should be treated equally for purposes of parity funding, for purposes of federal legislation, for constitutional purposes. This does not require a major ruling. This just merely requires that U.S. lawmakers take a position to treat Puerto Rico like a part of the United States. And that's not complicated. Thank you. Really? Thank you so much. Let's give them another round of applause for behaving, for doing this on time. So that basically means that we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and if you like to ask questions, I invite you to do that. If you're going to do a speech, make it very short. Yes, please. There's a microphone there that is working so that everyone can hear you, and people at home can also.
I forgot about the people at home.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Very valuable. And I would like to find out how to get a copy and everything. I'm at the booth, Pathfinder booth downstairs, and we carry this little booklet by Rafael Cancel Miranda that I think makes a really good argument about independence is a necessity. So I just would like your opinion on that. And I just feel that Congress is not going to do anything unless there's a big struggle and fight for all the things that you present. So I just feel we can't rely on it for the answer. I think
I will let the political scientists answer that question, but if any one of you would like to jump in, I'm sure I'm not going to jump in, but yeah, Charlie.
Sure. I believe in independence. I'm not a nationalist like Cancel Miranda. The bottom line is that only 4% of the population votes for independence in Puerto Rico, and a Facebook candidate can get more voters than an actual political party. Statehood is an impossibility for lots of reasons. The apportionment process would require redistributing 7 seats, and I just don't see that based on the population. And in terms of getting Congress mobilized, I think there are some possibilities to get progressives to get on board. But again, I believe that the political process is a decision by Puerto Ricans. The constitutional question, we can all deal with that. The problem is that I think it's simple, but most people in Congress are not that interested, even progressive liberals that continue to reify this position.
One of you want to touch the colonialism?
Yeah, so I'm also not touching the full part of the question, but actually just piggybacking. One advantage with having the growing mainland population of Puerto Ricans is that they are represented by Congress, and if they were to put pressure on their own Congress people, that could help sway. And again, there are more Puerto Ricans living on the mainland than on the island, and so that could be part of the game-changing situation that Edwin referred to.
Thank you. Hector, you want to touch on that? Diana is going to take note and put all these presentations online. I have a copy here. I'll email it to you. Thank you. Question, ma'am.
Hi, I'm June Carolyn Ehrlich, the editor of Revista, the Harvard Review of Latin America. I have 2 questions, if you permit me. One is, at least 2 of you made reference to the psychological damages of Hurricane Maria. And I think this is a real problem that a lot of people aren't talking about. What is being done or what could be done about this? In parentheses, there was a recent IDB study on a community in Peru that had been hit by a tsunami after an earthquake, and they found that in the 2nd generation, the trauma that was caused from this tsunami actually caused a decline in job rate, in mental health in the 2nd generation. So it's really important. The second question is about remittances. Traditionally there have been a lot of, remittances sent from the mainland to the island. But what's happening now? Did Hurricane Maria change the panorama of this because people have to reconstruct their own houses? Or what's going on with remittances?
I'm going to ask Hector to take a crack at the psychological trauma, if you don't mind. And I will address the issue of remittances later.
I think you have two parts to your question. The vulnerability that I mentioned sort of demographically, then when you kind of layer community level poverty, it creates a difficult situation before the storm. So for example, you hear emergency managers saying you have to have X many gallons of water, you have to have X amount of cash on you. So if you're living day to day, that already from the get-go becomes a very difficult stressor, right? When the thing lands, you're in more vulnerable place, more vulnerable property. So you're going to get the hit harder. Immediately after it lands, your personal and family networks are also as constricted and restricted and in crisis as you are. And then when the reconstruction phase comes in, you hear people in the radio saying, oh, but you shouldn't really live there, or, why didn't you protect yourself better? So that vulnerability at the community level is present before, during, and after the storm. And I think your second part was about what could be done, sort of. And I think Puerto Rico's civil society has grown and been very state-dependent for a lot of historical and other reasons. And I think the protection to communities of that is stronger civil society and stronger organizing. Puerto Rico's organizing isn't socioeconomic, it's political status. So a lot of organizing energy is spent on different political formulas, and it's not a class-based organizing, even though after Maria there's been a bursting, thank God, of kind of A, that consciousness, and B, a lot of organizations that are popping up in kind of what's called autogestión comunitaria and all those kinds of efforts to really try moving forward to empower kind of local communities. And I'll pass to Edwin to talk about remittances.
Also the suicide rate went up.
Yeah, I have some slides of the suicide rate in Puerto Rico, and it's really alarming. Before Maria, the rate was high, but after Maria and the age groups that it is hitting, the numbers are staggering and almost like double what the average for the U.S. is. I can share the statistics. The Puerto Rico Health Department has in its website a page just on the suicide numbers. And unfortunately, I didn't bring those specific slides, but that's a direct manifestation of migration is one, right? You leave and take your children away because you don't think there's a future for them in a place. And I don't know that there's any worse indictment of a place than to think there's no future. Or second, sometimes when you end up kind of taking your life. And third, I don't know if you've heard and others have about higher levels of abandonment of seniors by relatives that have had to leave and have had to leave them in very vulnerable home situations, sometimes in hospitals where they don't go visit and they stay there. So I wouldn't call the kind of Puerto Rico psychological climate today a healthy one. I think it's very much a crisis one.
Yeah. And there is a lot of autogestión,
Yes,
not only
I tried to emphasize that there are a lot of
right.
local efforts to really, and the solution is going to come from empowering and enabling a lot more of those local efforts to build that community-level resiliency, which is there in many places. I don't want to also paint a picture that we're all victims without any tools to really try to kind of take power and control over the circumstances. There's definitely a lot of that going on.
Thank you.
The remittances question is a bit more difficult because Puerto Rico is part of the monetary system in the U.S., and so there's no transaction to be recorded other than when you send money to your brother or sister in Texas. No one records that. So it's exactly the same situation. I will say that there was more, the concept of remittances, it was more emphasized way back when seasonal workers came and worked and then sent money to Puerto Rico and then returned to Puerto Rico. But in the meantime, when they were living here, they sent money back. There are a couple of surveys, of farm workers that were doing that. If you check, Ismael Garcia has a couple of papers on that. We just did I co-authored with him a paper. We did a survey about 4 or 5 years back on the few farm workers that we have. That one of the questions was about that. And I can't recall what the answer was, but I think because the flow has diminished so much in terms of seasonal workers that come back and forth, they're sending money back home, which is what remittances at the end of the day are all about, is less so. Having said that, the new phenomenon is the diaspora solidarity movement. There are two caveats to this. And so civic organizations here in the diaspora have sent a lot of funding to various organizations in Puerto Rico, so that's sort of a collective community remittances, if you will. And the other but anyway, so if you can think about it that way, I have another comment, but it's going to take us too much off track. So thank you. Yeah, question?
Yes. Hello to everybody. Thank you. A couple questions. One, it's that I found recently a memo from the la Secretaria de Hacienda. He said that it was incredible that 85% of the taxes collected by Hacienda came from wages, and only 15% of the people had their own own companies, own business, and then most of them declared that they had losses. And then he also said it was incredible that only 13,000 people in Puerto Rico earn more than $100,000. And he said that was incredible. So I wanted to see if you can talk a little bit about that.
Before you ask another difficult question, let's stop there for a minute.
Yeah, and the other one is more about the future of the debt with COFINA, with the clearance.
We'll talk about the second one in a second. I just want to ask Marie if you have data on the first question.
Yeah.
I don't have the data off the top of my head, but there is a concern, and it actually reflects some of the data that Hector presented in terms of the high poverty rates and earnings levels have also been very low on the island. With respect to the business formation, that's something that we had started looking at in our book, but we don't have the hard numbers to back that up. One of the, and I'll turn it over to Hector in a moment, it's something that we're very interested in looking, because that might be one of the ways that as the island's rebuilding, that there could be some entrepreneurial opportunities that have opened up. But again, I don't have the hard numbers. I think Hector might have some to share as well.
The Flamboyant Foundation in Puerto Rico did a report a couple of years back called Giving in Puerto Rico, where they tried to focus on the high net worth individuals. In that report, there's some Hacienda numbers about reported income, which I think is something you're trying to get at. Puerto Rico generates a lot of income, but the reported income is something else. The Puerto Rico tax collection system is very much a regressive system to some extent on, for example, sales tax, which is that COFINA thing. It's about as regressive a tax as you can get. But if you look at property taxes, for example, valuations are of the 1950s. So rich folk with a lot of property, and the deductions are crazy in terms of boats and second homes and things like that. So definitely the tax system to tax the wealth that is generated is something that needs an incredible amount of work in Puerto Rico. And of course, as you try to do that and fix that, you're going to get a lot of pushback, right? That you're hurting the wage job creators and things of that nature. So that's.
So you want to, COFINA, you want to expand?
Yes, because I was, seeing the chart that you presented, the biggest chunk of the debt was COFINA, and now they just restructure. And I was looking some of the details, and I got goosebumps because, for example, there was a lien of $2 billion that we're going to end up paying $15 billion in 2043.
Right.
So the interest on that is insane, and I just wonder how sustainable, given the projections of tax collection and population growth, is this agreement.
COFINA, which in general terms is the sales tax that is imposed to repay that debt. These are bonds that are paid with the tax revenues that start at 7.5%, as Mary explained, and jump to 11%. It's about 17% of the total debt, the total bond debt of $74 billion. So it's not the largest. It's not the majority. It's the largest portion. The second largest is PREPA, was also restructured. The COFINA deal, as I understand it, was that they have two classes of debtors, bonds, right? And the first class got about 90 cents on the dollar. First of all, it was reduced from 17 billion to about 12 billion. So there was a net transfer to Puerto Rico, reduction of the debt about that proportion that I just mentioned. And of those that remain, the sort of the preference bonds will get about 80 to 90 cents on the dollar of the debt that remains, and then the secondary debt will get about 50% on the dollar. So there was a haircut, but that haircut was nowhere near what will make that debt sustainable. Now, if you apply that rate, which in total will be about 50% haircut, right, when everything is said and done, and the government was projecting in the table that I show you 20 cents on the dollar, that means that you can't restructure the debt and repay with the reserve that the government put aside. So what it means is, what you saw in the budget is that now, instead of the $700 billion that were set aside, now it's more, $700 million, right? Billion, $700 million, which is less than $1 billion. Now the money that they're putting aside is over $2 billion to repay the debt. The other debt that is in the process of being finalized, the restructuring, is the PREPA debt, the electrical company. That debt by these standards, is going to be probably more favorable to the bondholders than the COFINA debt. Now, having said that, it is estimated that the kilowatt per hour will go up about 5 cents immediately as a result of this bond restructuring. And that's where the public interest comes into play. So the point is that the experts, and in the book we have a couple of people, one of whom is a Nobel Prize winner, so I think he knows what he's talking about, Joseph Stiglitz. He estimates that for the debt in Puerto Rico to be payable, sustainable, it would have had to be lower than the 20% on the dollar that they were submitting. Now imagine that it's closer to 50%. What that means is in a few years, probably less than 10 years, the whole debt will have to be restructured. And that debt, $74 billion, doesn't include what you just said, which are so-called capital appreciation bonds, that actually you don't pay interest. And until you're paying interest on those bonds or capital, they're not counted as part of the debt. But when they kick in, right, they will increase the debt substantially more for $74 billion. So wait for the next issue of the Central Journal, because it's an article that we're working on that will have that, detail.
I think people in Latin American studies are very familiar with the payment system, where workers used to do labor and were paid in tokens to the company store. And then they were sold the goods at a really inflated prices. The modern version of that is the COFINA bond, and Edwin gave you all the innards and the details. It is true that if you borrowed about $17 billion, we ended up paying about 55. So on the one hand side, I mean, I want to do that when I grow up, right? Get into that kind of business. It's a terrific way of multiplying your money. And the second part of that is that then you get the revenue by taxing the consumption of the poorest folks in the population. So how about that for colonial debt?
We have 10 minutes, so if we can take 5 minutes per question, I think we can take both. Yeah.
Gracias. Marta Bustillo, Universidad de Puerto Rico. Saludos, Charles. Va para ti. Tengo dos comentarios.
Bye, Carmen.
El primer comentario es si ya puedes comentar sobre la demanda de SSDI que existe y cómo sigue tu argumento, ¿verdad? Por esa línea. Quiero escuchar tus promisiones de lo que va a ocurrir. Y lo segundo, el asunto de la despoblación o depopulation en Puerto Rico. Creo que hay que ser un poco más cuidadoso porque se está dando una repopulation o una sustitución de algunos sectores de población interesantes que se están dando de migración que va a Puerto Rico y que está reconstruyendo inclusive barrios y partes de la ciudad, ¿verdad? Que va cambiando de perfil y que va trayendo otra población.
You mean gentrification?
Sí, pero es más complicado que gentrification porque porque también es un cambio de etnicidad, es un cambio de nacionalidad, etcétera, ¿no? Que no solamente la parte económica, pero la parte.
Can take the first question, Hector the second.
Sí. Pero Charles, no se olvides de comentar la.
So, it certainly would be of interest to see the repopulation. At this point, though, the concern is that without having adequate jobs, would be unlikely to happen anytime soon. It is worth pointing out, though, that there has been in-migration during this period. That's helped offset some of the major population loss. And that was that one graph that I showed had some of the in-migration. So actually, if you just look at the raw number of immigrants, Puerto Rico has received more immigrants than any single state. It's just that the outmigration has been so strong. With the low population growth, Puerto Rico has a very low fertility rate and already did before Hurricane Maria struck. With the low fertility, now that there's been more outmigration, people who are having kids are having them on the mainland, not on the island. The last couple of years, what is referred to as natural increase, the difference between live births and deaths, has turned negative in Puerto Rico. So even if Puerto Rico was sealed off, the population would still continue to decline without any more outmigration, just because of the difference in the births versus deaths. So one of the concerns, or one of the solutions would be, well, if there was a viable economy, then that would likely draw people back. Puerto Rico certainly has a lot of strategic amenities. It's not that people want to happily leave the island. It's a very beautiful place to be. So it's a lot of the reasons why people are leaving is because of the employment situation.
I completely agree that the flow has been huge of people coming back and moving out. I think 30,000 a year go back. So the numbers are pretty healthy. When you look at the trend as it is today, that's the projection. In the 1960s, Puerto Rico saw a very healthy return migration. So the potential is always there, right? We're just projecting what we know based on kind of what we know. Now, there is gentrification in certain parts of Puerto Rico. There is an increase in that inequality. And there are areas where you can visibly see within Puerto Rican population substitution by income. You're also seeing more richer Americans, because of some tax incentives, moving into areas like Vieques, where it's very visible the change in the ethnicity of the population. I am not a fatalist in the sense that when you look at who lives in Puerto Rico, still more than 90% of people that are in Puerto Rico are Puerto Rican. And I'm not afraid that Puerto Rico is going to be Puerto Ricanized. But there's certainly those visible trends demographically. The gentrification by economic status, more people are now moving into the city as opposed to suburbanization of the past. And you see that in the whole Ponce de Leon area, which is ripe for that kind of repopulation from people that before would have gone to live in Guaynabo somewhere, right? And certainly you see more richer Americanos in enclaves like Dorado, Rio Grande, and things like that. And it's a very visible contrast. But by numbers-wise, I don't think we're quite at the level of Puerto Rico is the Puerto Ricanizing, if you know what I mean.
The big pattern is that Dominicans have left Puerto Rico, and Puerto Ricans are going out to work in Santo Domingo, which tells you a little bit about the integration of labor markets and how they work. And so my hope is that we can bring them all back because they're immigrants are an injection to economic development. And the type of working class, the Central American people I know and Latin American people I know in Puerto Rico, they're pretty much, kind of middle class and working class. So the more we can get, the better. But I don't see like Hector and Marie any population substitution. The small number of Anglos that are going there with Act 22 and the like, they're,
a drop in the bucket.
I think we need more migrants to Puerto Rico, but that's my opinion. Please.
I wanted to ask about some of the reconstruction, assuming that funding actually becomes available. One thing that I have heard is because of U.S. regulations, you have to rebuild what existed before the disaster. So if you had a fossil fuel dependent, inefficient, decentralized electrical system, you've got to rebuild that terrible system instead of transitioning to a green, decentralized, et cetera. Is that a problem that's happening, and if so, is it happening in areas other than the energy? Because it seems insane to rebuild something that was already obsolete and needed to be replaced.
There are two or three components to your question. The first one is that Congress actually enacted a law that allows Puerto Rico to build better than what it was. So, and the legislative mandate was just clarified. Centro is going to put out a report on this because the fact is, for layperson people in the room like myself, if you have a lake that has this capacity and the storm created this much mud, the prior Stratford Act will allow you to bring it to where it was. But if you think, if you can justify passing a new regulation, municipal or central government, that the real mitigation effort is to reduce to increase the capacity and to go down to the rock in that river, the new funding, the new law that was passed for Congress for Puerto Rico allows you to go to build better than what it was. That was not applied, in answer to your question, to the electrical grid. Okay, there are two parts of that. One is whether fossil fuels is what it is. The other part is whether alternative energies are going to be allowed to come. That's a complicated equation because the law was amended to facilitate the integration of green, alternative energy into the grid. The grid is not ready for that, on the one hand. On the other hand, by increasing the electrical rate so much, there's going to be a backlash from the private sector to generate their own energy. And now the law doesn't allow you to discriminate as much as the prior law allows you to charge you taxes to pay for the bond that was owed to to the bondholders. So all that is in flux. We don't know exactly where it's going to end. And in Puerto Rico, we have the tradition of not enforcing laws and regulations that favor, for example, green industries. So all that remains to be seen. But what I can say is that the Stratford Act, if we take advantage of the legislation, this is what our Congress people did. I'm talking about the Puerto Rican delegation with their allies in Congress. Stratford Act now for Puerto Rico allows you to build better. And it's an opportunity that we need to take advantage. So that means that for the next major disaster, if we act purposely, we can do better. Whether it's in the power in Puerto Rico, look at what's happening with the funding and all that rest. But the law itself is an opportunity that we have to take advantage. And I think this,
One more response here. So we'll both respond here. Okay. So just to contextualize the question that Professor Bustillo asked me. In the early 1980s, the Supreme Court ruled in Harris versus Santiago Rosario and Califano v. Torres that it was legal to discriminate in, at the time, AFDC funding, but general parity funding for Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico was an unincorporated territory, because Puerto Rico did not contribute sufficiently to the Treasury, and because granting more federal aid to women with dependent children or families with dependent would hurt the local economy. Those are the basic three arguments. And that's again anchored in it justifies discriminating against Puerto Rico because helping Puerto Ricans would harm Puerto Ricans. In a recent opinion, the Peña Martinez, a visiting district court judge in Puerto Rico, and this is, when I say recent, I'm talking April, essentially said those arguments no longer hold. Puerto Rico, at least until 2006, contributed more to the federal treasury and taxes than 5 states together of the Union, including Wyoming and Vermont, mostly because there are more Puerto Ricans in the island than there are in Wyoming and Vermont. Second, there's no justification for saying that helping Puerto Ricans with parity funding actually hurts the economy. And the logic behind this is that today, under SSI funding, if you go to live in Moscow or North Korea or Cuba, you can receive more supplemental Social Security income than if you live in Puerto Rico, because funding for Puerto Rico is determined by block grants, and block grants are limited. Again, based on the status of the issue. In this particular case, you had an individual who worked in New York all his life. He retired, and for the past 10 to 20 years, or 10 years, he's been collecting SSI through a bank account in New York. And the question is whether, since he hasn't been living in New York, he's moved living in Puerto Rico, should he pay back all the additional money that he collected through his bank account in New York because he retired in Puerto Rico? And this court, visiting court judge said, no, forget about it. So the question is whether it is possible through the courts to revisit this discriminatory legislation that makes it legal, constitutional, to discriminate against retirees in Puerto Rico and for parity funding in general. And this court seems to be suggesting that it is possible to revisit that. How far will it go? I don't know. I haven't heard much in the media either. But
There is no SSI in Puerto Rico. There's the TANF program that has half of the population, which is the traditional single women with young children that is very poor, and what used to be the aid to the elderly, blind, and disabled, which is the other half, which still exists in Puerto Rico. It has about 50,000 cases. The two programs combined in Puerto Rico out of a 1.2 million poor population. So this program, which in the literature becomes the reason why people in Puerto Rico don't look for work, it's a tiny little program that is capped and that discriminates because those half of the people that are in that aid to the elderly, blind, and disabled should be in SSI. But there's no SSI in Puerto Rico because Puerto Rico has a very high disability rate. And the Social Security Administration, which manages SSI, has had people inside that have said, if we put an SSI in Puerto Rico, the doctors who have a lot of power in that program are going to start signing off people. And this is going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's a very clear example of the same citizenship passport carrying very different consequences, and nothing illustrates it more than a person that worked all their life in New York and decides to retire in Puerto Rico, and for that reason is stripped of access to that program. So SSI is one of the policy areas, in addition to the child tax credit and others that the Centro has have worked on, where you can see clear program inequality, where Puerto Rico, with twice the poverty, has half of the tools to be able to fight, because programs in Puerto Rico are not anti-poverty programs. They're income maintenance take what we give you, shut up programs, which is a very different thing than fighting poverty. What we need is resources and the kind of integration of effort and case management to really deliver, in addition to economic development tools, on poverty. And people confuse or think that there are programs in Puerto Rico. When you start unpacking that, you realize that they operate very, very differently.
And let those be the last words. And I really want to thank you again for delaying your trip back home. Now, drive safely, and thank you so much for being here. Thanks to the panelists for doing a wonderful job. I couldn't find any more experts than this crowd. So thank you. Thanks for being here.
Snappy bun.